I'll introduce myself and then turn it over to you to introduce yourself, and we'll jump into some of the questions. I'm David Sherbuck. I'm a former reporter and editor at Forbes. I started at Forbes.com, and I'm now a freelance tech journalist. And I'm working with Wow AI in preparation for their webinar coming up next month. With me is Noelle Silver. Noelle is the founder and CEO of the AI Leadership Institute. And why don't you give us the rest of sort of the introduction, Noelle? I don't want to make any mistakes or steal your thunder.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I am the CEO and founder of AI Leadership Institute, which actually came out of a time I was an early member of the Amazon Alexa team. I was part of the team when, well, we didn't have a VP or even a director, right? It was a very small team, about 10 of us. And from there, I was given an opportunity to kind of go globally and start talking about a thing that no one had ever done before, specifically around artificial intelligence and speaking to devices in our houses, something that we all maybe do now, or at least have a choice to do. But I was talking to a lot of companies, and I was getting in like the Fortune 500 CEOs. None of them really knew what to do. So I founded this company as an effort. I actually partnered with Microsoft and Amazon to deliver to these executives just enough AI literacy so they knew what they were getting into when they invested in these services. I'm also, though, an executive at IBM. I run the Azure AI and Analytics organization. I'm the go-to-market leader for them. So I spend a lot of my days, again, talking to clients and just making sure that we're not just selling a dream, that people really understand kind of the responsibility side of implementing this technology, because we learned a lot of hard lessons. We'll probably get into some of them. We learned a lot of hard lessons in those early days of Alexa. I spent a few years at Microsoft building the early days of what is today known as cognitive services. And again, it's just unique to have a chance to see things go from, 100 calls a month to 2.3 billion calls a month, right? It changes, what you do and what you wish you would have done. So now I spend my days trying to help others not make our same mistakes.
How did you get interested in artificial intelligence? Was it in college or even before?
Yeah, no, not really. I guess I've been interested in it since I was like 6 years old. My dad raised me on the golden age of science fiction. So I've been talking to robots in my mind for a long time. It's actually the most interesting and somewhat ironic thing that I actually got to work on something like Alexa, because I had been, reading Asimov and Bradbury for decades before that became a reality. But that's how I got interested. I was just kind of already really interested in science fiction becoming fact. But then I also had two really compelling reasons why I moved more practically into artificial intelligence. And that was around my son was born with Down syndrome in a time like 17 years ago. But surprisingly, back then, they were like, there's no world for him. He can't survive here. You should put him in an institution. Right. And as a technologist, that didn't sit well with me. And then my dad ended up suffering. He ended up getting hit by a car as a pedestrian. He's a Marine, so he's fine. But he got hit by a car as a pedestrian, and it took away, like in 2014, the year we launched Alexa, it took away his ability to use a phone or a computer. And so I instantly was like, well, now we've got this thing. I don't know what it's going to be, but everything I built on Alexa, I built with those two use cases in mind.
Wow, that's fascinating. Alexa is now, I think, 7 years old, which seems to me, it was almost yesterday that it was.
Yes.
But am I correct in the speculation that it's the device that really brought AI into the mainstream, but whether we're aware of it or not?
Yeah, I would absolutely. I don't think, I've spent a lot of times on stages throughout my career talking about, I'm a technical evangelist, so I talk on stages all the time. And I remember at the beginning of Alexa asking people, just about natural language, like how much tech do you talk to? Wouldn't it be cool if we could just say something and our technology would respond? What about robots? All of that was literally science fiction to the audiences that I was talking to in those early days. And we had built it. A lot of these technologies we're using today are 50 years old. It's not new. These models are actually quite mature. But the world really didn't have a use case to get behind. And I will share with you the one thing I think propelled it was Jeff Bezos back then made a very distinct message to our little team and was like, Alexa will be everywhere. And he said this in 2013 when I joined the team, and he's like, Alexa is everywhere. That's what you want to say. Now, I, even in the first year, started saying voice is everywhere, right? Voice enabled technology. Because I mean, who knows I didn't know how well Alexa would do. It turned out to be a good investment, but you never know. But the idea to talk to tech instead of go through a device or a screen or a button, yeah, I definitely think that opened the eyes to people like, wait, and they don't even know, to your point, they don't even know that it's artificial intelligence, right? They just are like, wow, it's pretty cool that I could just talk and this thing does what I ask it to.
Well, what do you think are the enabling technologies that took those 50-year-old mature technologies and made them suddenly so viable and so pervasive?
I think one is, kind of product market fit, right? And maturity of the audience. So Google Glasses, for example, if those came out today, they would do much better than when they came out the first time. Timing is everything. So sometimes these technologies, I remember when I was first starting to learn about AI, they were talking about the AI winter and how, like all of these AI scientists, data scientists, machine learning experts, like they were not the cool kids, right? Like in the dark rooms trying to figure stuff out. And then all of a sudden they came out of winter into spring and became the most popular, right? They now, you go in and people are high-fiving them as they go on stage. It's ridiculous. Like these people, they're in their 70s going, wow, between the age of 20 and 60, they had 900 people read their papers. And just in the last 5 years, they've had 900,000 people read their papers. Wow. So it's just, I think it's a level of maturity in our world, but it's also combated or maybe paralleled with this concept of privacy, right? And digital awareness and user agency of data. Because I will tell you that I'm surprised to find out every time the statistic grows higher that 30% of people will not invest in any speaking, any device that has natural language in it because they're afraid it's always listening. And that is a surprise to me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of the ethical or at least the social concerns over AI. As soon as Alexa appeared in our living rooms and the Google Assistant and Siri and the rest became the inevitable, conspiracy or paranoia that they're listening to us. This is George Orwell's Big Brother made real. Talk a little bit. I know that you're pretty passionate about the ethical applications of AI. Can you sort of give us a landscape of where the threats are and where the changes are coming?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to be holistic kind of in our understanding. These concerns we have about Alexa actually have long been in place, in the context of like our phone, which is way more dangerous than an Alexa device in your house, as far as, having 75 apps with all different privacy policies, all of which asking you for access to your microphone and your camera with really no restrictions to their use. So I do think one of the things that I liked about how we approached it at Amazon is there was a principle that we applied to making sure that our privacy language and our data usage language was very simple, right? So if you went in, it was like 4 lines. The danger is literacy. So we would tell people, we're going to use your data in order to make better choices and give you a better, more convenient life. And I'll share with you very quickly a story about, I went to a conference, I was speaking to 4,000 people, and I asked them if I could eliminate airport traffic forever. And the only thing I had to do though was surveil you, your car, and everyone inside it, know your relationship so I could accurately time, right? If you're a couple versus a son, mother versus a roommate, right? I could accurately, but I'd have to know all of these things about you. Would you be willing to give up, all that stuff in order to get this convenience? And 90% of the room without much hesitation was like, absolutely, I totally would. Now, granted, they'd all flown to get there and probably were very recent, but how interesting it is that we're willing to give up that convenience or give up that privacy in exchange for convenience. And Amazon in the early days really took advantage of that, right? They said, look, we're going to make your life more convenient, but we need your data to do it. And we all said yes, but I don't think people really understood what that meant, right? What does it mean to have my data? And what are you doing with my words? And that really, we were very transparent in the fact that we were doing it, but I don't think the understanding of the world using that technology was at the level that they could even really conceive of.
And is that a matter that people don't understand the value of machine learning, of contributing or pooling their data, and even if it's marked anonymous or if it's identifiable? Do you think that people understand how an AI-enabled system gets smart over time?
I think there's some people. I mean, the good news is we've got Web3, right? And Web3 is really forcing people to rethink data. And the fact that, some big companies have done very well, Amazon included, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, right? They've all done very well getting data from people for free. And Web3 is really shifting that a bit to say, okay, you can use that data, you can even make money on that data, but there needs to be equity in understanding and even profit sharing potentially with the people you're using that data for. And I think that's part of the ethical shift we're seeing, right? Even these big companies are now implementing. I mean, Apple's one of the good ones, in my opinion, in this specific sense, because they heard the audience, right? They heard the world saying, hey, this doesn't seem right. And now we have the ability to go to any website and provide a fake email address, right? Where we're not giving our data for free. You're going to have to earn it a little bit more for, it's a choice I have. I go to the site, Apple pops up a little dialogue that says, would you like to use your real address? Or would you like us to mask it for you? Awesome. Like, that is ethics at its finest. Give me the choice as the user instead of just blindly sending my data to people. So I think we're getting there. I think the other thing, the nice thing about ethics is that ethics, in my mind, actually translates more to responsibility for companies, right? There's not a whole lot of ethics is a tough nut to crack inside a corporation run by stakeholders. We'll just say that. But responsibility is another thing, right? Because responsibility is tied to your brand. It's tied to showing up on Forbes.com. It's tied to, like, if you do something wrong or if you infringe on the needs of your customers, like, they will find out through the media. And so they become more responsible because they're interested in protecting their customers and keeping their customers ultimately. So I think there's a double edge there with the responsibility and ethics side of things.
Can you give some examples of what you consider, and you don't need to name names, just generally unethical AI?
Yeah, sure. There's tons. So I always tell people, you could go out and just set a Google alert for like AI gone wrong. And there's plenty of examples. So even right now, right, we have Meta released its Blender bot, right? The Blender bot is trained on the world's like internet data. And what it ends up being is a conversation with a conversational representative of the world's data on the internet. And if you know anything about the internet, well, for example, you could ask it who won the presidency in 2020 and you won't get a clear answer,
right?
Which is confusing, right? So I always tell people, it's something that we have to be very careful about. And so BlenderBot is a perfect example. Right now, you can go and test it out and you could see it instantly shows systemic bias, right? It'll prioritize Caucasian males in areas that, like, if you ask it for examples of CEOs, it will not come up with an African-American CEO, right? It will come up with others. Or if you ask it, what are professions for women? Homemaker is like number 2, right? I'm like, wow, really? Okay. So that is an example, but there's also a little bit more practical examples, right? So that's kind of a fun example. I actually think it's great that Meta did this because they made it accessible for everyone to see how bad it could be. And that's really nice. And Meta can afford that, blemish, if you will. Not a lot of companies can. But Amazon had they used AI, and Amazon uses AI everywhere, but they used AI, and you can look it up. It's been written about many times. They use AI in hiring. And I have always been against AI in anything that would be demographically oriented, right? Because it's going to contain these biases that are very hard to eliminate automatically. So they created a hiring bot and it instantly started finding candidates that were a whole lot like their past candidates, their past successful candidates. But guess what? They all looked the same, sounded the same, went to the same schools. They all went to the same universities. They all happen to be Ivy League, right? Like, it created these patterns, which it's funny though, the result seems good, right? If you're not carefully looking at it, you're like, man, we're getting rock stars from Yale and Harvard. Like, this model is working. But then when you take a step back, you're like, oh wait, except, we have 10% women, which is exactly the same amount we've had for the last 10 years. Like, some of those biases end up perpetuating bad behavior. And that's where ethics comes in, right? That's when we have to go, is that right? Could I keep doing that and make good money and hire good people? Yes. But ethically, should I do that? Like, isn't it better if I maybe infuse some inclusivity that the model won't be able to be trained on automatically?
Right. It's sort of a past is prologue problem. If you train the system on the past, it's going to replicate the past.
That's right.
Introduce at least the conditions that exist now, or you anticipate in the future.
And I'll tell you, like, I was at NPR. I'm sure you know those people. I was at NPR as the VP of engineering, and one of the biggest things we were trying to do was leverage algorithms to help diversify sources. Because as you know, as a reporter, right, you go to the same people who can deliver, and it tends to not even about ethnicity or gender. They just tend to be the same type of person because that's who a reporter has a relationship with. Right. And so this AI model would be like, hey, you use the same source or the same geographic area or the same gender of source, you might want to consider. Like, it just bubbled up a change in the thought process for humans. And that's what I always say, like, anytime you have human to human interaction, like hiring, healthcare, like, you really have to be careful what you choose to let AI, discern, if anything. I usually like to see it augment, like if I have to review 100 radiology images, boy, it'd be nice if I only had to review the 10 most likely that need my attention. And AI is perfect for that. It's not perfect for going in and saying, oh, I see these images, here's their diagnosis, and send the medication to a patient, right? That's dangerous stuff.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I heard on NPR years ago a story about the impact of AI on radiology. And I think it's one particular obscure condition that a human radiologist was able to detect 80% of the time, et cetera. But they just trained it with so many examples that it got to the point of something like 98% accuracy.
Yeah.
Yet in medicine, that 2% meant there still had to be a radiologist or a human involved to vet that result.
That's right. And especially in like COVID, right? It accelerated, though, a radiologist's ability to get through more cases. And that's where AI really shines. Like, that's its best use case. But to actually have AI start to do, which is what happens in hiring, do the diagnosis, make the decision, choose who goes and who doesn't, who gets care, who doesn't, who gets an appointment, who doesn't. Those things are so, the interesting thing about BlenderBot is that it was capturing biases without actually really being trained ever on that data, right? It was just absorbing variables from the data that was never intentionally trained on. And that's the danger, right? Is that we start to see AI make decisions now in very tight use cases, like even healthcare or hiring or procurement. But when we start combining these models together to make larger decisions or manage larger workflows, those little inequities turn into big inequities that we see companies suffering from.
That's fascinating. What about these predictive systems? I've seen complaints about systems that will predict if you're pregnant or not.
Yes.
Or period trackers, or things that I guess go into the uncanny valley of robotics, but only in AI. Like, wow, this knows a little too much. Therefore, it's either spying on me or...
Yes. Or you've divulged information that you didn't. I mean, this is what AI is good at. Like, it can be really fun to give it a bunch of data and find out, we call it anomaly detection, right? Find out what anomalies comes out. And you're like, oh my gosh, I never would have seen that with my own eyes. Similar with pregnancy or even cancer diagnosis, right? And to take it to a totally not serious, like produce. I was able, we can use computer vision now to tell, long before a human can tell, the date of expiration of produce based on what it looks like, 40 days before expiration or when it's picked from the tree.
Wow.
And so now, produce growers can actually choose, all right, this is actually, 20 days from, this is 40 days from, this one will need to send locally, this one will need to send abroad. They can, literally programmatically define how the robots place the produce and get it to where it needs to go with the least amount of waste.
Wow.
That's awesome.
That is
awesome. And same with cancer diagnosis. I want to know as soon as possible if there's any pattern whatsoever that matches historical patterns. The danger is in the inclusivity of the data used to train these models. So oftentimes, and Alexa is one of, the culprits of this. In the early days of Alexa, it was trained mostly on male data. And I remember many wives calling me and being like, why does Alexa listen to my husband more than it listens to me? Not great for branding, by the way. Women have a very powerful, buying power in the household. So we don't want to do that. But in all seriousness, it showed, same with people in the United States who speak English but have an accent, right, or English is a second language. There's lots of people in the United States with this, situation where they learned to speak English once they got here, and Alexa did not respond to them. Even easier, Oakland, California, this NFL player, his name was Marshawn Lynch. He calls up Jeff Bezos or the VP of Alexa and is like, Alexa's broken. And we flew out there to fix it and found out it couldn't understand his accent. So in the end, all of those scenarios, we just trained it on better data and Alexa got better.
Right.
But most companies, don't have the money and resources to train for these nuanced conditions or the leadership insight to know that it's necessary. And I always say diversity and inclusion is expensive. I don't mean it from a hiring perspective. I mean it from a technology perspective. To get the right data set that's truly inclusive of all of your audiences, that's going to cost you. But then your funnel of sales gets bigger, right? Your funnel of customers gets bigger. But most of the executives I talk to, at least in my first conversation, they don't see the forest for the trees.
Right. Now, in technology, the law or policy and regulations always lag. And so there's a constant sort of, I wouldn't say lawless or anarchy at a certain level, but there's a lag between what the law covers and what it doesn't. Are you concerned that there's going to be an overregulation or some sort of backlash towards, like an algorithm review committee or regulatory agency?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of hope so, actually. I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of companies are taking it, I should say certain companies that care about this problem are taking it upon themselves to build in this governance. It's not the same as IT governance and change control boards. This AI governance and data governance is kind of this critical, someone and really a multi-stakeholder, inclusive team of people that think about it from all angles need to really be like, is this a good idea? And without that lens, you end up releasing into the wild something like BlenderBot or the hiring practices at Amazon. That's what ends up happening when you don't have this kind of larger team sitting outside and going, we call it design justice, right? In the industry, where you want to make sure you don't just think about the happy path, which is easy and fun and usually makes a lot of money, but also who could this hurt? I always think about those girls. There's a bunch of women who have confronted me as a messenger of Alexa, that they named their daughters Alexa about 6 or 7 years before Alexa came out, which put them in first and second grade when Alexa was it's still a good place, but it was in a prime, right? It was selling 1 million devices a year, it was doing amazing. And the interesting thing that happened though, is that those young women, those girls, these are first and second graders, started to get bullied at school, commanded around like a robot. They didn't want to go to school anymore. 100,000 of these girls. It was crazy. These are the types of, someone on there, some mom on that advisory board should have been like, so have we thought about the kids with this name? We didn't have that lens. Nobody asked that. I did ask about what about special needs kids? What about, older, elderly, people in nursing homes? Because that's where my life was at and I was that voice. But a lot of times companies don't even really include or create a space for those voices to be heard in these early design phases of these products.
I'm conscious of the time.
Sure.
Is there anything that you'd like to add to the discussion that I haven't asked that I missed?
No, I mean, maybe the only thing I would say, just for context, is that we do see AI have significant success in two main areas. One is digital contact centers, right? Being able to solve people's problems very, very quickly, like especially in business processes where we know if you ask me a question, after you ask me or after my customers ask the 400th time, I probably don't need a human to do that work and I can actually serve them faster. So digital contact center, and then intelligent workflows, which I love that world, right? Where I just recently worked with a company, they do death insurance, and they shifted from the take a piece of paper and mail it in, right? The death certificate, mail it in, and in a couple months, we'll let you know when it goes through all the approval processes, will let you know. Now, meanwhile, someone's passed away, there's a hurting family, likely there's financial distress, and they're going through these manual processes. So this company decided to create a chat bot on WhatsApp, right? And you go into WhatsApp, you send it a message, and in that message, it says, oh, please, take a picture of the death certificate. They take it in, and with 100% accuracy, to your point earlier around, like, you trained it enough, you know exactly what those forms look like. With 100% accuracy, it extracts that information, sends it to all the different actuaries and approval processes simultaneously. And within 3 days, they can, unless it's an anomaly, but if it's, a standard case, within 3 days, they can have, their benefits enabled. And that's like life-changing, again, coming from someone who, is in that spot of my life where I'm dealing with those things. But so many companies could leverage this technology to create conversational apps that allow people to do things that used to take months or still take months, and turn it into days. And why wouldn't we do that for our customers?
Wow. Well, we'll end on that. But I have to thank you very much. This is
yes, this is so cool to talk to you.
This is fun.